Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us again on Connecting Conversations with Cohesia Connect. As you know, I'm Ivelka Powell, your host for today's podcast. And today we have one of my really good friends with us, Nathan, who he will introduce himself shortly. But if you haven't already done so, subscribe, listen, and like our previous podcasts. This month is celebrating Pride, and we had a brilliant podcast last week. So feel free to check that out. But into today's session, we really want to get into the nitty-gritty of sharing someone's personal story, enlightening us all with what someone from a different background goes through, but also bringing to light some of the challenges that we face in today's society, and also how we overcome them. But thank you, Nathan, for joining us on our podcast.
Thank you.
Here with us.
I'm so happy to be here. I mean, my face is giving everything away. I have listened and watched to the majority of Cohesia Connect connecting conversations before, so being here is a surreal experience, but I am so excited. No pressure, no introducing me as like a good friend or anything.
You are, and I'm like, just so the audience is aware, we talk a lot behind the scenes, all things in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion is something that we're both really passionate about, and it just made sense for us to get on the podcast. I know we share things privately about what we see in the world and the things that we would want to change, so it's just great to bring your story here and allow you to have a voice to be yourself.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So before we get into it, I haven't done this for a while. So as everyone knows, if they haven't already, I love The Diary of the CEO by Stephen Bartlett, and I do have his conversation cards, and I'm actually going to read one out for Nathan. So the question I have for you, I did a little random mix. We should really get some effects to do that. The question I have for you today is, do you think your younger self would be proud or look up to you now?
Oh, that's such a profound question. Okay, so before I get into that, I guess I should just do a very quick visual description of myself for anyone that maybe can't see me. So my name is Nathan. I am a white male. I'm 34. I have blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm wearing blue glasses. I'm in a red shirt, and I'm sitting in a wheelchair that I refer to as a sort of a rusty bucket on wheels. Okay, so now that that's out of the way. What a fantastic question. I definitely think my younger self would have a lot to be proud about. I think we would definitely recognize each other. There's been a lot of growth going on, but I think ostensibly I'm the same person. There have just been a few little augmentations and things going on. So yeah, I've always lived with a disability. So I live with cerebral palsy, a particular kind of cerebral palsy called spastic diplegia, which basically affects my mobility. And it also affects things like muscle tension, muscle spasticity. So everything is a little more tense than it would otherwise be. But in addition to living with that, because, being one kind of minority isn't enough for me, I'm also a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, and I'm very, very proud of that. It has taken me a while to sort of overcome internalized ableism, internalized homophobia, but I'm in a place now where I genuinely feel out and proud about myself, and it feels good to be here talking to you about that.
Oh, thank you. And to be honest, that's what we created this podcast and this space for, is to share people's real stories and be authentically themselves. And for us, it's really important that we have provided a platform for others to listen, engage, and hopefully be educated and become more accepting of other people's differences, no matter where they come from. So you've given us a little bit of a background to you, and I guess my first question in terms of your experience and how you've navigated the world is, what do you think the world's view of disability changed, and if so, in what way?
That's a really good question. I think the easy answer is that in some ways it has, and in some ways it hasn't. And I was reminded of this when I had the opportunity through the company I work with to attend the Harkin Summit on disability last year. And that, for those who don't know, the Harkin Summit was established in America, in Washington, D.C., and it's a sort of a global disability conference. And so the theme of last year's conference was disability in the workplace, and there were some really great talks on that. But there were some visiting MPs at the time as well who were talking about bridging the disability employment gap. And while that's technically true, while that has technically happened statistically, what actually happened was that in 2013, the definition of disability was revised to also include things like mental health issues. So disability became a much more broad church. And in essence, I'm all for this. I definitely think we need to be painting with a much broader brush and understanding that experience is nuanced and diverse, and that that my experience of physical disability is going to be vastly different from somebody who has experience of neurodivergence, or who has experience of, say, a visual impairment. All of these experiences are going to be massively have massive variance to them. But also, through my work and through our conversations, I think we understand that despite having really different experiences and really different backgrounds, there's an awful lot of overlap, really. There's an awful lot of sort of sympathetic resonance that happens with these stories, which is why I'm so glad that platforms like this exist. Because, like I said, I've listened to a few of your other episodes, and by and large, everybody sort of seems to be singing from the same hymn sheet, which is that more stories is never a bad thing.
No, certainly. And I think in terms of we all, I guess for me, the frustrating bit is that it sometimes feel that because our experiences are different, and so segmented, there is no path to bridge that together and bridge that common cause together. And I know there are spaces and communities that are perhaps doing more than that than others. But I think at the end of the day, we're all fighting against a system that has historically
Right.
and culturally segregated us from time and time again. And it's those same structures and systematic behaviors that have continued to push this agenda of being separate, this agenda of individuality, rather than a collective, cohesive community in which we
Mm-hmm.
all live and embrace and, experience each other in a respectful and accepting way. And I think sometimes we forget that we're all perhaps fighting against the same enemy.
Exactly.
It just may look different from where you're standing, but at the end of the day, we all up against the same systems that have perpetuate, you know, that has perpetuate lack of inclusion, and a very hostile environment where difference perhaps isn't really isn't really seen as a positive. So,
Yeah.
talking about systems, actually, and this is something that perhaps I haven't seen many people talk about. And it wasn't until we've had the discussion where I was enlightened by the experience you had. And I would love for you to share it with our audience. And that is, how has the social care system impacted or worked for you particularly in the UK. I know the social systems elsewhere, there are variances, but how can you give us an insight as to what the social care system is like for someone living with disabilities? Is it what we see on the news, that there's a constant lack of funding, and if so, how does that impact someone on the other end? We only see from the outside, but we don't see how it's really impacting the individual.
Yeah, the human impact, absolutely.
Mm,
So I
mm.
should say before I give my personal answer that this is a really nuanced
Yes.
area, and so everybody's individual experience is going to be different here. But I'm just going to speak to my lived experience
Yeah.
because I think this informs my perspective. So I should say that I'm fortunate enough to live in a system that allows me to access this care for free. I don't privately subsidize this, so it allows me to be able to live independently, essentially. Because if I had to source care, I would have to sort of pay through the eye teeth for it, and then it becomes then that's an entirely different conversation of, are we actually further discriminating against disabled people by unnecessarily monetizing things that should be basic human rights? I'm going to sidestep that one for now, and just tell you about my my
Yeah.
experience. But basically, the short answer is I've been in receipt of domiciliary care for about 3 times a day since I was 19 years old, and I went away to university. And so what generally happens is I have help to get up in the morning and showered and breakfasted and all the rest of it. I then have carers that come in at tea time and the carers that help me back to bed at night, essentially. And that's the very basic rundown of that. And I've gone through various different private companies that provide that service to varying degrees of competency and care. And I suppose my first observation is that you're never guaranteed the same level of service, even if you stay with the company that you're in. Because it happened to me recently where I was moved without any notice from one run onto another run. I wasn't told if the times of anything were going to change, so I had to actually voice message my boss in a panic to be like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it into work tomorrow morning on time,
Yeah.
because I've just been told at the 11th hour that this change is happening, and I'm essentially having to roll with it. And this was a the care company was within their rights to do it because it's in their contract, and their
Yeah.
contract is with so in Northern Ireland it's called the Health and Social Care Trust. Anywhere else in the UK it would be the NHS. So essentially, because I'm not paying for the service, ostensibly I don't have a voice about how that service is delivered to me. So that's the other side of being on the receipt of free healthcare. And part of me is very aware that that same system is also funded my electric wheelchair, without which I'd likely be sitting on a beanbag cushion.
Yeah.
There are so it's not that I'm not grateful, but I want to point out that there are serious flaws with the system, and the
Yeah.
flaws come really from a lack of funding, but also from a lack of staffing. And where there isn't a lack of staffing, a lack of proper training. I mean, I have used lots of mobility equipment in the years that I've received domiciliary care. So I basically know all of the things inside out and back to front. And so
Yeah.
I know I could deliver moving and handling training if I absolutely have to. But there are instances where carers that should be trained in how to use hoists, for example, come in not knowing anything. And then you're, say, at 6:30 in the morning, having to give ad hoc training to staff that really should know how to work things. So
Yeah.
see, disability in itself is never the problem. It's all of the obstacles and all of the other challenges that sort of get heaped on top of you on a daily basis, that then it starts to become corrosive. It starts to sort
Yeah.
of eat away at your fortitude and resilience, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's so true. I think, again, it goes back to the system. It's a system that that is essentially further disabling the person. You already have to live with, different challenges, and being different, but then you have other people furthering that and exacerbating the experience of having additional challenges as a
Mm-hmm.
result. And I think, yes, I do agree in terms of the funding is a massive issue, and we see it in the news all the time. We see it then have a knock-on impact on staff, and they're trying to get loads of staff in, so you get
Mm-hmm.
staff that aren't properly trained, and it's a whole ripple effect. And there is a loss of the human element at the end of the day, whereby, and we had someone on our podcast, I think it was last week, and then we had the Pride the week before, but talking about human rights and how we
Mm-hmm.
need to hone in on the human rights element. This is not just a discussion of diversity and inclusion. It's a human right, a basic human right. And I think
Definitely.
we some there are sometimes I feel that that is forgotten, and it's just about perpetuating a certain idea, or we have all these policies and initiatives to support people with disabilities, but the real system is, it is not seen as a human right, and it's not treated as someone who is human. And I guess that goes into my next kind of question in terms of accessibility. We see the larger systems like social care and NHS, the
Mm-hmm.
government, and so on and so forth. But how does accessibility impact on a day to day? So let's say we're going to a restaurant and stuff. Do you think society is better, or yeah, it's better equipped in terms of accessibility and accommodating for people with different backgrounds when it comes to people living with disabilities?
Well, I wish I could say yes across the board. I think since the passage of the Disability Discrimination Act in, I believe, 1995, there have been improvements made to public buildings, and there is this sort of gradual shift in public perception towards a broader spectrum of disabilities. It's not just somebody in a wheelchair or somebody with a guide dog or a cane anymore. People are aware of, people that might be hard of hearing or people that have visual impairments. So there have been improvements. I don't just want to come on the podcast and lambast society for being, not good enough. However, there are still massive strides that we need to make. You used the example of going to a restaurant. I still have to get into the regular habit of, if I'm booking a reservation anywhere, whether that be at a restaurant or a hotel, whatever it is, to check that they have access, because it's not standard across the board. And where a company will say, oh yeah, we have a lift, I'll need to ask, is your lift big enough to accommodate my electric wheelchair? Because there are still issues there. I mean, this is just coming from my personal experience.
Yeah, yeah.
I've never, when I've been out to a restaurant and sat down to a meal, I've never had the experience of having a braille menu, for example. But really, if we think about it, that should be available as standard. We really should be designing for the 1%, and then and assuming that everybody has enhanced needs, because fundamentally we do. Everybody does. Not everybody is going to identify with the disabled label, but everybody
Yeah,
has something, some sort of adjustment that will make
would
them
make
more comfortable.
yeah, and will make it easier for them.
Yeah. And so I think really the larger part of this question is, if society isn't up to snuff yet, if we're not at a place where these sorts of design improvements are made as standard, we have to ask ourselves why. Because I think
Mm.
enough conversations are being had now that disability really isn't a dirty word anymore. People know, whenever we think of disability, we're not just thinking of Dr. Stephen Hawking anymore. We're not just thinking of the same people who are exceptional individuals, but sort of siloed and
Mhm.
venerated in their own little bubbles. We have better role models. There's still a way to go, but the conversations are happening. So something else, something systemic, must therefore be impeding efforts that ordinary people are trying to make. And I can only conclude that uh, it's because it's far easier to keep designing like we have been doing, because the assumption is that the vast majority of the population isn't going to benefit from a braille menu. But I mean, I for
Mhm.
one would love to learn braille. I think, even if I don't need it right now, there's nothing to say I won't develop an impairment later on, that then, having learned that skill, that will benefit me.
Yeah.
Similarly with things like sign language. I mean,
Mm.
I'm fortunate enough to donate to a local charity that helps support tutoring sign language to
Mm.
children in schools, which I'm
Wow.
I'm hugely in favour of. But I
Yeah.
also think, proud as I am to support that, I also think, why is that not taught as standard? I mean, I would definitely have preferred to learn BSL than French.
Wouldn't we all?
you know, I definitely think that would have been a much more. I'm not saying that French isn't important, of course it is, but
No.
I
Yeah.
think in terms of what's practical and what will help
Mm.
most people, and what, we're talking about connecting conversations. If we're going to build bridges, surely improving the ways we communicate, that's one of the big fundamentals right there.
100%. And one of my friends is actually a speech and language is studying speech and language therapy, and she recently went to learn sign language. She did BSL, and she's actually going, well, her passion is to then be a speech therapist. And I learned a lot from her in what she was learning and what she was experiencing, and even down to, you know, going into sessions um with people who she utilized speech language therapy with. She even saw that there was a disconnect in how a white person would treat a person of ethnic minoritized background. And
Yeah,
because there was a lack of understanding, it was just applying the same systems and methodology as if it would work for everyone, not
right. Yeah,
acknowledging the nuance of someone who is struggling with their speech, but also um, the added layer of they can't communicate with you because they communicate in a culturally different way. Um, and
exactly.
these are the nuances that we fail to recognize. And because we work or we live in a system that tries to homogenizes us in as one and wants everyone to be like each other, it we
Hmm.
then lose and chip away. And then for me, I find it a little bit contradictory, because then you have corporate organizations on the other hand saying, oh
Right.
yes, I want everyone to be the authentic selves and stuff like that. And it's just like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure we all can be, because at the end of the day, there's a wider system at play that doesn't allow for that.
Right.
So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is that with the best will in the world, we can want everybody to express themselves authentically, but it's whether or not you have that comfortable atmosphere that allows you to self-disclose. Self-disclosure is the first step. You have to well, it's like coming out in a sense, I suppose. You have to first, admit it to yourself, and then you share it with others. And that process, especially for those of us who have hidden disabilities, that can be quite grueling, because the assumption is, oh, well, you've passed as being, able-bodied for this long. Have you just been, putting this disability on or whatever, and the frustration in having to explain, not only, no, actually my personal experience is different because of XYZ, but then also framing that against the historical context of, we think of the sort of brutalization of minorities that happened under things like Nazi Germany as only affecting certain groups of people, but disabled people were rounded up as in that as well. This is bias against disabled people goes back a really long way, and again, this is probably a topic of conversation for another time, but it does inform the kinds of discussions that we can have about authenticity now, because it's about, do you feel comfortable enough in the first instance to disclose, and are you supported enough when you do disclose to feel like you can be your best self at work or at home or wherever that happens to be? Really, we know, and anybody listening to this podcast knows, that if you live with a disability, that in and of itself shouldn't be an obstacle to your success. Sure, you're going to have different barriers and challenges to overcome, but in theory anyway, you should be able to have the resources that you need to meet those and feel supported in overcoming them, and feeling proud of yourself, crucially, for doing that. But I think that isn't a universal experience yet. And I think it's because, as we sort of touched on earlier, everybody's experience is so individual. But like I said, there's an awful lot of overlap there, which is why I think the more we start talking to each other and sharing these things that happen, like, so for instance, I had to go to the gym today during my lunch hour in work, and as I was leaving, so the bin lorries had been out and they'd left full bins on the drop curbs, so I couldn't have access to or egress from the pavement via the drop curb. So I had to go out into oncoming traffic to circumvent the obstacle that had been created by bin men that should have known better. That is just one small example where I had to dice with death because somebody didn't think that anybody would be coming along with a pram or coming along with a wheelchair or whatever it might happen to be. And that's just one tiny little thing. And, and people go, oh, I'm dealing with a lot of anxiety during the day and I don't know why. Maybe it's because all of these little microaggressions build up during the day and you don't even consciously realize they're happening until you go, no, wait, there should be an easier way to do this. I should just be able to use the drop curb. Just something as simple as that.
Yeah, no. And I think it's the little considerations that we often overlook, the things that could make our life easier. And even, working in recruitment, how can we make it much more seamless? How can we make it much more inclusive, where people feel like, if they apply for the job, they've applied for it, their CVs and applications are actually being looked at and considered, rather than being looked away or being, you just get the automated email, for instance. And if they go for an interview, that's why I think it's very vital feedback is given. And I know there are some organizations that fail to provide feedback, whether because of time or whatever it may be, which is understandable. But I think there needs to be a level of emotional intelligence to understand why this is important. If you've spoken to someone, and even like it's like a face-to-face, you're speaking to someone and the other person on the end is not responding, and you're just like, why are they not responding? And I think it's just, courtesy, that really, that is taken away from the whole situation. And then when we look at the stats of people from ethnic minoritized backgrounds, but also people living with disabilities, people that are transgender, for instance, people who are even pregnant going in for interviews and feeling that they're being discriminated against because of who they are. I
Right.
think, it is quite, I think we should have come so much further than we have in terms of
Yeah.
our understanding of this stuff. And just going back, when they apply for these jobs, this is why feedback is so important, so they don't feel like they're overlooked, and
Yes,
so they feel
absolutely.
that their time is not wasted. So even simple things like in recruitment, as an alternative, we can do to help and make the situation much more be more mindful about the situation people are in. So in terms of just going off on a little bit of a tangent,
Mhm.
you
It wouldn't
also
be like us.
I know, you also mentioned that you are part of the LGBTQ plus community,
Yeah.
and having that intersectional identity does add
Hmm.
its layer of different challenges because of societal perception, and
Right.
societal understanding of things. So how have you navigated that space, being someone who is disabled and then entering that space? And is it a space that you felt that was inclusive of you having a disability?
That's a really interesting angle to ask that question on, because it's not what I thought you were going to ask me. So I'm rewriting in my head as I speak to you. But yeah, I really do think so. What I suppose what you're asking me really, it's a question of pride, and
Mm,
it took me a while to sort of cultivate that pride internally,
mm,
because we're so conditioned to see these things as character flaws, or
mm,
obstacles to overcome, or and it took me a while on a personal level to sort of reconceptualize those as things that add to me as opposed to take away from
mm,
anything that I am.
mhm,
But I will say that working in recruitment and working in this space, I definitely do feel that we call it the LGBTQ plus uh, IA plus ERG or whatever, but really it is inclusive of everybody because allies are included in that as well, and that's a really important distinction to make. In that, I think for a while. That's not to say that safe spaces aren't important, but I would
mhm,
rather a very broad church in the first instance, so that
mhm.
everybody feels that we can at least be on the same page. Because
Yeah,
good allyship is so important, because
yeah.
we as advocates can speak to us to each other in
Mm,
bubbles, but that won't have any broad-reaching change or broad-reaching
mm,
consequences
mhm,
ultimately, because the kinds of people that we need to meet halfway don't reflect our lived experience or
mm,
aren't familiar with our particular challenges. So one of the things that I do find that I have a lot of kinship with in the LGBTQ plus community is I'll say I have a lot of sympathy for the trans community, because I know what
mm,
it's like to be sort of using a body that doesn't necessarily feel like your best representative. I know what it's like to wish that you could present something other to the world, but to
yeah.
be sort of uh, relegated to something else as a result of that. And so I think it's I'm still learning. The whole point of this is that I'm not going to be reflective of everybody's journey, and
Mm,
I'm not going to have all the right answers. But the
mhm,
distinction that I want to make is that at least now I feel in some way heard and seen and supported to want to chase those answers and to
Yeah.
be a better person and to make myself a better ally to all the different kinds of marginalized minorities that there are. Because I think it was uh, Voltaire. I'm going to paraphrase Voltaire very badly
Mhm.
when I say that while one person in humanity is enslaved, nobody is free. You know,
Mm.
there's that going on with this as well. So this can seem like a really lofty goal, because then it's like, oh well, we're just going to be fighting this interminably, because there's always a minority to represent. But then if I flip that on its head and ask the question, well, why wouldn't we fight for that? What good reason is there to not fight for somebody who is underrepresented, or
Mhm.
maybe who can't advocate for themselves, who
Mm.
doesn't have that voice? You know, I I I wish I had somebody to fight for me when I was 5 years old. You know, that goes back to the question you asked at the beginning. Would my younger self be proud of me now? And I think one of the reasons that he would be, that little Nathan would be proud, is that big Nathan's learned to sort of stand up for himself. And
Yeah.
I don't really enjoy confrontation, but I've learned to acquire the skills necessary to have those conversations, because
Yeah.
unless you're willing to have the difficult conversations, the dial doesn't move in either
Mm.
direction.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think you've literally like sung from my own personal hymn sheet in the terms of why should we not fight for that person or that individual or that group? I think for me, even as a little girl, I always wondered like I and this is such a fond memory for me when I was a little girl. I remember seeing on TV an advert of people that looked like me but
Yeah.
had less than me. And it was obviously one of those adverts where I think it was maybe like those water aid adverts
Hmm.
for some countries in Africa, or it was a food advert, something similar along those lines. But even at my petite age, I wondered why that was the case and why
Yeah.
there was this difference when they physically looked like me and I was safe in a home, being fed and watered. Um, but they didn't, and they looked around the same age as me. And for me, I think that really stuck with me as a core memory and as a core experience. And ever since then, I was just like, I used to sing and be like, I'm going to be a humanitarian because humans are great. And I want to save all the human beings on the planet. That was
Yes, I
my,
feel that on a spiritual level. Yes.
and that was the little me just thinking, oh, yes, that's what I want to do. And I think once I learned my voice,
Hmm.
my grown up voice, I knew exactly, and learning and experience different things. I think I came to the conclusion this is the way for me to fulfill that, and why Cohesia Connect is so personal to me, because it's more
Hmm.
than just a business. It's a purpose, it's a mission to drive change and to create a space where everyone feels like they are equal in the most basic sense, but also feeling this, creating this space where we acknowledge that there are challenges, but how can we work together to create solutions that
Yeah.
together we can make a huge impact, because this is not a mission for one person, unfortunately. And by gathering people that are like-minded, that have and experience things in order for us to shape a better world for the future, I think is very, very important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think that better world is going to be arrived at without people that have that instinct.
Yeah.
And that's the other side of this coin, is that there's so much apathy. And I suppose
Mm.
the because we're used to a world of politics. We're used to a world of big promises that are made by lofty seeming idealists that then, nothing really seems to change on the ground
Mm,
level. So I think we'd had a conversation recently, and you'd said something to me that really resonated, which was that, the best change begins at the sort of grassroots level, from the
mm,
ground up.
mm,
You begin at that baseline level and work upwards, instead of dealing with the top and then trickling
yeah,
down.
yeah, yeah.
um, and so I really do think, uh, don't get me wrong, as your friend, I have loved coming on this podcast, but also it speaks to that bigger philosophy as well of,
Mhm,
if this can help one or two or three other people, how many will then feel inspired to go on and share their stories and have
mm,
more conversations and open more doors, because it isn't just about uh, either of us, speaking to each other. This is about something much more broad, which is that we
mhm,
recognize that the world as it is essentially is not fit for purpose. It isn't good enough yet. And we recognize a few simple ways that we could enhance that or make it better for people. And I mean, I
mm,
know just from having worked in recruitment that we have been able to place people in work who have various neurodivergences since I started. And
mhm,
we've been able to uh, put in place various reasonable workplace adjustments for others. I've had
mm,
lovely emails from people to say, your support is what's making the difference here. And
mhm,
those things matter. Those aren't small things to me. Those are the reasons that make me want to get out of bed in the morning.
yeah,
It,
mm,
it's those real tangible improvements that you can sort of, at the end of the day, you think, yeah, I made somebody's life better today. Like, that's what's
mm.
worth it, isn't it?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think even speaking with one of my colleagues recently, and she was navigating a difficult situation, and the fact that she came to me for help, and I felt honored that she could have come to me and share how she felt, and be open and honest with the experiences she was feeling, because realistically, the same experience she was experiencing, I felt like that too. And
Yeah,
in a strange way, I didn't feel like I was alone in the situation I was in. And this is why it's so important to share stories and to connect with one another, because you're never alone. There are someone who has gone through a situation or is going through a situation, but they've one of them have made it out on the other end. They've seen the light and they found
yeah,
strategies and solutions that work, that could, I'm not saying it's going to work for everyone, but that could perhaps be adapted to suit you on your own journey to help you get to that place. And I think this is why we need to kind of bridge people together. There needs to be a stronger sense of community, stronger sense of allyship in all aspects of life. And even if we take the D&I, diversity and inclusion element away from it, we're all
hmm
human beings at the end of the day, and shouldn't we all be
exactly.
working together anyway? Isn't that just common sense?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I totally agree. I would love to live in a world where labels like diversity and inclusion don't apply, because
Mm.
they're the standard, because that's the standard that we work to. We are inclusive because it is. We are all
and I think
humans.
and I think we all hide behind these terminology of diversity and inclusion. It for me, and I think because it's been perhaps overutilized, and yes, we frame ourselves as a D&I organization to fit within the quote unquote labels, but
Hmm.
essentially the work in which we do as a business is to kind of deconstruct those labels by looking, okay, what's actually happened underneath those. Let's
Right.
go let's go under let's go and look at the iceberg below to really see what your definition or what your experiences are, or what the impact has been, to really understand, okay, why hasn't certain solutions, or even to come up with certain solutions and strategies to benefit those who have been marginalized, silenced, as a result of the wider system. So for
Hmm.
me, I think we need to challenge this terminology in order to understand what does it, is it just being used performatively with organizations? Oh yes, I'm diverse and inclusive, yeah, we're doing great, we have all of these different things that we're doing and celebrations that we honor, and don't get me wrong,
Mm-hmm.
those are all still very important. But I think for me, are you really challenging the system, or are you just amplifying the system to do what it started out to do in the first place?
Yeah.
And that is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where this idea of flexible working comes into the conversation, doesn't it? Having a workplace where you feel comfortable to, yes, you do your work and you have your, your allotted amount of work that you do at your desk, but then you have your time as well. And as long as you're doing the work and meeting your targets, you should also be free then to have the dynamism to go and, like me, go to the gym on your lunch break. You should
Mm-hmm.
be able to have that flexibility. I mean, I know whenever I joined the company I'm currently with, I was asked if I needed any reasonable workplace adjustments. And I said, and that was over the phone at the time, and I'd said, yeah, I could really benefit from a height adjustable desk, just to make sure that I'm,
Yeah.
typing at a reasonable height and seeing
Mm-hmm.
everything at the right level. But I had no way of knowing then, what the wheelchair accessible toilet facilities were like, or
Mm.
any of that, or I had no way of really conceptualizing that I would need flexible hours for, say, doctor's appointments. That
Mm-hmm.
because so this is another thing that I haven't touched on yet, but living with a disability, I find that sometimes the working assumption is that you don't work, or that
Mm.
if you work on a part-time basis, so that when appointments are offered to you, they're often given during work hours, and you can't negotiate to say, well, actually, can this be rescheduled for, say, 6 o'clock in the evening, because by
Mm-hmm.
then everyone else has gone home. So the assumption is that you'll be able to get transport first and foremost if you can't get
Mm-hmm.
there on foot, and that you'll be able to just make the appointment and drop everything at a moment's notice. And that
Mm.
isn't the case. And so I've been very fortunate in my current workplace environment to benefit from um, a sort of a flexibility that allows me to say to my boss, oh, I have a doctor's appointment coming up in a week or 2 weeks. Am I
Mm.
able to take these hours and then work them on other days and make them up
Yeah.
at other times? And my boss
Yeah.
is like, yep, that's no problem. That's absolutely fine. And that reassurance in and of itself is such a huge
Yeah.
psychological boost to me, because I always used
Mm.
to think, I'm not going to be able to go to the doctor. I'm not going to go to that podiatry appointment because I'll be risking my job if I don't,
Mm.
do these set working hours. And
Yeah.
so one of the great things, I mean, COVID was terrible for a lot of reasons, but one of the great things to have come out of the pandemic, for me at
Mm-hmm.
least, is this embrace of uh, of flexible working culture, and this
Yeah.
idea that it applies to everybody. And I really enjoy that. It's something that I hope continues to develop. I hope we don't now start to slowly, gradually,
Retract.
revert back to a culture that becomes, office only, or because
Mm.
because that's another thing about even walking into the office. Like, I live in the city that I work in, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like a 40-minute walk away. Well, I use the term walk loosely. I should say roll, really, or something, but then there's no appropriate verb. So
Even the
so
language is disabling us, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. So it would take me about a 40-minute walk into the office, and there's nothing to say that the chair won't break down unexpectedly, as has happened to me before. And the current repair system is
Yeah.
provided by a company who I won't name, because I don't have very nice things to say about them, because because currently they only operate Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So if you break down, you have to hope that you break down during those hours. Then they're only legally allowed to provide you repair assistance if you break down on your property. So even though this is an outdoor power chair, if you break down away from your home, you have to find some other way to get home. I mean, I know one gentleman who broke down in the center of town and had to ring the fire brigade to come and help him home so he could get the assistance he needed. I once, so there's a big street in Belfast called Royal Avenue, and I once broke down both literally and metaphorically on Royal Avenue, and and it was in the rain, and I rang the support line, and I said I'd broken down, and they gave me the spiel of, oh, well, you'll need to find some way home. I was on my own at the time, so I was panicking about how I was going to do that. And then they said, oh, well, because I had said, so do you drive? And this person said yes. And then so I asked, so what happens if you break down on the road? Do you get roadside assistance? And this person said to me, no word of a lie, they said, yeah, but that's what I pay insurance for. And this is the sort of this is when I talk about obstacles, this is the sort of attitudinal obstacle that's absolutely unnecessary. There was no need to say that to me at all, but that was what someone thought was acceptable to say to me in a professional context. And I know that I'm not going through this alone. There are, in Northern Ireland alone, there are thousands of wheelchair users. So this isn't an isolated problem, and I'm sure people throughout the UK and throughout the world feel this when I say this, that this is the kind of sort of, when we talk about systemic oppression, there are very real ways that manifests. So even when it comes to simple things like getting to and from the office, there's a reason that I love working from home, and it isn't just that I get to luxuriate over my morning coffee from my desk at home. It's that it mitigates the risk of going out and potentially breaking down, and then having to explain to my boss, oh, I know we had that really important meeting scheduled with the exco or whoever it might be, but I can't make it because of a technical issue, and I'm really lucky in the fact that I know that my boss would be supportive of me, and I know that there would be that atmosphere of support there, but I really feel it for disabled people who aren't in that position and who are made vulnerable through what is essentially the ignorance of other people. Because you mentioned evil before, and it's easy to throw a word like evil around, like it's somehow larger than life. But it's funny how often evil and ignorance are really two sides of the same coin.
No, totally. And I think, and I don't, for me, when I use that terminology, it's not to put anyone in an uncomfortable position where, well, kind of, I'm going to be honest, like kind of, you have to be made uncomfortable, because these are not comfortable conversations. But it's not to say that people are bad. I think it's more of a discursive way in demonstrating and describing how situations have turned, because if the situation had just exist, then we could look to see what other solutions and strategies. However, we then get in contact with people who have different thought patterns, have different experience, that then applies a certain label, shall I say, a certain way of looking at that situation and bringing out the worst or the best out of it. And I think it comes back to looking at the system and the people affected by the system. If I'm honest, if the system had just exist, then we, without any kind of associations to it, I'm sure it would be a very different way of looking at things. But because we have people who perpetuate their own understandings, their own way of doing things, and then calling that the norm, that is then problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's problematic in a frustrating way because it doesn't need to be this problematic.
No.
That company I mentioned that offered that wheelchair repair service used to also offer weekend breakdown cover, and they withdrew that in 2017 because they said that not enough people were using the service. So it was essentially a money saving exercise that that withdrew that support. And so I'm very conscious when I speak about anything like this that support is never guaranteed. You know, when we say that we fight for rights and we fight for support, it's not just that we want to fight for anything new, it's that we want to fight to keep what we already have against a backdrop of things like austerity and fiscal responsibility and all of these other wonderful words that we use to describe what is essentially downsizing. It becomes this thing of what fundamentally is important here. Is it profit margins, or is it the people? Is it the people that are using a service that can, because ultimately disabled people, people from minority backgrounds, we work hard. We are a powerful resource. We are a massive benefit to your company, to your community. I can only think of pluses, but that's where we happen to be lucky enough to be supported to do that. And I think when we are, the results speak for themselves because
Yeah.
we want to work, we want to contribute, we want to be part of the change. I just don't want to sit at home and twiddle my thumbs and not take responsibility and roll up my sleeves. I'm
Yeah.
prepared to get my hands dirty and really get into the middle of this and do what I can to make my part of the world a bit of a better place for everybody coming up after me. But in order for that to happen, John Donne said, "No man is an island," and I really feel that about all of this.
Yeah.
Nobody succeeds just on their own.
No.
If something happens that's good, it's because a whole network of people held them up. And I also want to. It's not enough for just for me to do well. If I know that people around me are struggling, I really want to help. And that's why, to bring it right back round to what we started talking about at the beginning, that's why I'm so proud, because I'm proud of the whole community. I'm
Yes.
proud of not only the friendship that we've cultivated, because I've learned so much from even talking to you and hearing your lived experience, but the entire community that's sort of reflective of that. And I think, it's podcasts like this and chats like this that give me cause for optimism, because it's things like this that will change the way that society works. It's not
Yes.
a politician in Whitehall or a policymaker in Whitehall. It is the people on the ground that have the passion and the conviction to really push for the change that they passionately believe in.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And you've literally done my closing for me. You've literally took the words out of my mouth. Um, so to be honest, I don't know what better way to end on this note of bridging a sense of community, bridging a sense of support, bridging a sense of optimism to what we experience and the barriers and the challenges that exist. There is a way out. There is a solution. There is a strategy. We just need to work together and support one another. Continue to share stories. Continue to educate people. Continue to be confident and comfortable to sit and say that you're struggling and why you're struggling, because the other person on the other side of the room could could also benefit from hearing that someone else is in that boat. And sometimes it does feel like we're a bit on an island and we don't know our way out,
Yeah.
because it feels like the challenges and the barriers are compounding. But I'm hoping that our audience today come to the realization that that is no longer the case, and that was never the case. And there is spaces, there is communities where they can feel like they can be seen, heard, and be their authentic self by sharing their stories without having that additional layer of it all being performative, or
Yeah.
it's not conducive to how they want to experience life in general. So thank you so much, Nathan, for being on our podcast. It's such a privilege to have you here. I'm so humbled to have you here on our podcast and sharing your story with our audience today. So I hope everyone feels empowered. I hope everyone can take at least one takeaway from the conversation today, and be able to use it in a way that will enable change. So thank you all, and have a lovely day, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much.